So my name is Gabrielle Bohlman. I work in the Forest Service's Region 5 Ecology Program, where I help support the 4 Northwestern California National Forests. So that's the Klamath, the Shasta Trinity, the 6 Rivers, and the Mendocino National Forest. So today I'm going to be talking about a post-fire restoration strategy that I developed for the 2018 ranch fire based on the post-fire restoration framework that Mark just presented on. At the time, the ranch fire was considered to be California's largest recorded wildfire, but was just recently surpassed this summer by the August complex, hence the second largest wildfire correction on this first slide. My focus for this talk today, though, will be on identifying opportunities for using fire as a key restoration tool within the ranch fire footprint. I'm going to first provide some background for the ranch fire, some context. I'll then talk a bit about the process of developing the restoration strategy, and then focus in on some of the main outputs that highlight the use of prescribed fire as a key restoration tool. And before I do continue, I want to note that I developed this strategy as sort of an initial example of how we could be applying the post-fire restoration framework to a large complex landscape such as the ranch fire footprint, as well as really expand on some of the discussions I was having with the managers on the Mendocino National Forest in order to sort of further help them think through some of the key restoration opportunities, as well as support future project planning. So first, a little bit about the ranch fire itself. It burned in Northwestern California, largely on the Mendocino National Forest. This area falls within the North America Mediterranean climate zone, so with hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters. Average annual precip ranges from about 20 to 60 inches, with nearly all of this falling during the cool winter months. Some of the main vegetation types present include yellow pine and mixed conifer forest, oak woodlands, chaparral, and serotinous conifers, as well as some higher elevation types such as red fir. The ranch fire burned a total of over 410,000 acres, 288,000 of which burned on the Mendocino National Forest. And like I said earlier, the ranch fire was at the time the largest recorded wildfire in California. It's now actually considered the second largest fire, with that 2020 August complex being mapped at over 1 million acres. And the August complex actually burned most of the remainder of the Mendocino National Forest. So here you can just see the extent of those 2 large wildfires. But back to the ranch fire, this fire burned hot. Over 50% of it burned at high severity. I do want to note that while this is a really large proportion of high severity fire, this area also supports quite a bit of chaparral and serotinous conifers. So it's not totally unusual for many of these areas to burn at high severity. Nonetheless, it burned very hot in areas that also historically would have burned at lower severities. And while the post-fire restoration framework can help guide the development of a strategy for multiple different vegetation types across the landscape, I chose to focus in on yellow pine and mixed conifer forests for a few reasons. These forests tend to be the main focus for managers due to the ecosystem services that they provide. They are also often the most departed structurally and compositionally due to past management, including selective logging and over a century or more of fire suppression. And these are also areas that are often one of the first areas that land managers often look to when considering restoration options. And in developing a restoration strategy for yellow pine and mixed conifer forests, we defined the analysis area to include all Forest Service lands within the fire footprint, plus a 1-mile buffer around the fire perimeter. And the reason for the buffer was due to both the interest in collaborating with adjacent landowners, as well as recognizing the importance of incorporating adjacent unburned areas for consideration in the final strategy. And the primary management goals for yellow pine and mixed conifer forests include maintaining and restoring ecosystem integrity, diversity, and connectivity, promoting long-term sustainability of ecosystem services, and really increasing the resistance and resilience to different stressors such as climate change and fire, as well as insects and disease. So keeping the analysis area and management goals in mind, I used relevant spatial data such as fire severity, existing vegetation, fire return interval departures, among a few other data sets in order to work through the post-fire flow charts shown here that Mark just outlined for the restoration framework. Don't worry too much about trying to read this. I know the text is really small and blurry, sorry about that. But I'm not going to talk too much about this since Mark just went over it, but I do want to highlight the three categories that restoration opportunities can be divided into when using this framework. So the first are those areas where you might maintain or promote desired conditions. So these are areas where the post-fire conditions on the landscape are either meeting desired conditions or are moving in the direction of desired conditions and may require minimal to no management actions. The second are areas where you might take management actions in order to restore desired conditions. So these are areas where the post-fire conditions do not currently meet desired conditions, and management action is needed to sort of redirect that trajectory towards desired conditions. And then finally, there may be areas where you need to reevaluate desired conditions. So these are areas where it may no longer be feasible or desirable to attempt to restore a previously desired condition due to things like climate change and other stressors. So in working through this framework, I was able to produce outputs that could feed into the final restoration portfolio that Mark showed an example of. And also produce a spatial map where these different restoration opportunities could be shown on the landscape. So here you can just see a really simplified output for the analysis area where the three main categories are highlighted across the landscape. Maintain and promote is in green, take management action is in orange, and reevaluate desired conditions is in red. And rather than talk through all of the different restoration opportunities that were identified in the strategy, I want to focus in on a few situations that provide opportunities for bringing fire in early to aid in obtaining desired conditions on the landscape. So there's a few specific target areas that represent situations that would benefit from bringing fire in as one of the key restoration tools. The first are areas that really fall into sort of the most straightforward management scenario. So these are areas where fire severity was within the natural range of variability. So areas that burned at low to moderate severity, where fire return interval departure is considered low to moderate. So areas that have missed less than 2 fire cycles, for example, and where stand densities and fuel loads are at acceptable levels. So management goals in these areas include maintaining ecosystem health and function, and also promoting that historical fire regime. So these are areas where fire, either prescribed fire or managed wildfire, can be used as a key restoration tool. The assumption here is that the ranch fire really worked to move these areas towards a desired condition, and that the vegetation structure and fuel loading in these areas are such that managers are likely to see desirable effects from applying fire on its own. So the second target area includes areas that either remain unburned during the ranch fire or burned within the natural range of variation, yet are still considered extremely departed with regard to their fire return interval. So stands in this situation are likely still overly dense, and fuel loading is typically remains high in these areas. So the management goals here are to increase ecological integrity and also restore an active fire regime. And due to the high stand densities and fuel loading in these areas, it's often necessary to use mechanical and/or hand treatments in addition to prescribed fire in order to really achieve desired conditions and desired effects of burning. And finally, the third are areas that burned at high severity, where there is a low probability of conifer regeneration, but have been identified as suitable for reforestation when considering other factors as well. So the management goals would be to reduce the risk of reburning at high severity, reestablish conifer cover and likely connectivity, and restore the historical fire regime. So the key restoration tools here would be mechanical and/or hand treatments, often with the need to remove standing dead trees, which are often abundant in these previously forested areas that have now burned at high severity, potentially followed by prescribed fire to further prep a site for planting if needed. But really with the longer term goal of being able to bring fire back in again once the trees are established and large enough to withstand low intensity fire. So really trying to ultimately restore that historical fire regime in these areas as well. So again, in these areas, there is a need to take management action sort of in order to redirect the trajectory towards a more desired condition. And of course, there are advantages and challenges of using fire as a key restoration tool. Wildfire can act as sort of a pre-treatment by reducing fuels and creating conditions where applying fire on its own is both feasible and beneficial. Wildfires can also really help direct our management by highlighting specific opportunities where we might gain the most benefit from applying fire, for example. And then finally, fire allows for the treatment of more acres. We can reach more acres on the landscape with fire than we might be able to with mechanical treatments, especially in areas with limited accessibility. And then some of the challenges. So departure is often so high in these yellow pine and mixed conifer forest types that one wildfire really isn't enough and can often increase fuel loading, making it really challenging to apply fire without pretreatment and still obtain desired outcomes. Another thing is that multiple factors need to line up to carry out a prescribed burn. Burn windows can be really limited, especially down on the dry, hot Mendocino. And there's often a lack of qualified personnel available when there is a good burn window. And finally, while the use of fire is becoming more acceptable, I think the public is understanding the need for it on the landscape. The pretreatments that are often needed in order to see desirable effects of prescribed fire are not always as widely accepted, which can cause some issues. So with that, I want to give a special thanks to Hinda Darner and Gary Erdahl, along with several others from the Mendocino National Forest for their insight and contributions to the development of this strategy, as well as providing several of the pictures that I included in this presentation. So thank you.